Before we start, I'd first like to warn viewers that this video will contain spoilers for pretty much all the Yakuza franchise, especially Infinite Wealth, seeing as that's gonna have a central focus for today. So bear that in mind, and if you're still looking out for spoilers, then maybe this is not the best time to watch this video. Unless you don't care about spoilers, in that case, welcome. Today's topic might seem like a jab at the franchise or the character of Kiryu, but I want to stress that it's more of an observation than anything. This is all coming from someone who's been playing the game since like 2007. I've played just about all the mainline games and the spin-offs as well, even the cursed gacha game Yakuza Online. So before you go, oh my god, Devil Leon 7, how could you call my favorite character, Kazuma Kiryu, a hypocrite? Stick around for a bit and see what I have to say. Yakuza or Like a Dragon is one of my favorite game franchises of all time, and I want this video to just further fuel the discussion about the character of Kazuma Kiryu. Still, this video is going out on this wonderland called the internet, so I do understand that regardless of what I say, someone's out there bound to take this as me saying Kiryu is a horribly written character. And okay, honestly, I think we can all agree that at the bare minimum, there are parts of Kiryu's story that could have been written much better. But even in spite of that, he is still one of the most iconic video game characters. There's plenty of incredible moments that he brought to us, plenty of moments that people are fond of. Kiryu leads a life that's always been full of trouble, and that's been true since the earliest depictions we've seen of him, where he looks up to a crime boss father figure, wanting to be as respected and renowned as he was. This man was, of course, Shintaro Kazuma, whom we surprisingly still don't know that much about. In the 2006 Like a Dragon prologue movie, we see even earlier depictions of Kiryu's life than we saw in the games, where we get a glimpse of things otherwise never seen, like Kiryu and Nishiki's school life, where even then, they were used to getting into fights all the time. Early in Yakuza 0, we see a flashback that would be the culmination of Kiryu's desire to join the Yakuza as a teenager, manifested in a fight between him and Nishiki against the aforementioned crime boss father figure, Kazuma. We don't really get much context of before what happened here, but it's just enough for you to fill in some blanks. For a while, Kiryu likely repeatedly kept asking Kazuma to work under him when he just kept pushing him away or turning him down, until it got to a point where he wanted to be taken more seriously and prove his strength, and so it just cuts to the aftermath of that. Laying on the ground after being completely floored by Kazuma, Kiryu went on about why he wanted to join the Yakuza, his admiration of Kazuma, and how he wanted to be just like him, a formidable figure with influence that demands respect from everyone around him. Of course, it doesn't take long for us, the player, to know how quickly Kiryu came to realize that this life might not be the best for him, or at least not the shadier and darker aspect of it. To this day, and as far as my memory recalls at the moment, the most ruthless thing we've seen Kiryu doing as a criminal was attack the civilian in a back alley in the beginning of Yakuza 0 for debt collection. I say as a criminal here with an emphasis because in any game where he is a Yakuza, so either Yakuza 0 or 1, he's not a Yakuza anymore after like 1 or 2 chapters of those games. In Yakuza Kiwami, in one of the newly added scenes, Nishiki asks Kiryu about a casino scam to bring in some money, and Kiryu expresses uncertainty about it because he says he doesn't like the idea of scamming civilians. This is yet another extremely rare example of Kiryu being seen involved with actual criminal schemes as a Yakuza member, and because of how rare glimpses like this are, this makes it one of the best examples to use when talking about how Kiryu didn't like being a Yakuza as much as he thought he would. I know what you're thinking, but Leon, what about that time in Yakuza 1 where he uses a waiter as a human shield? That was brutal, and he basically killed someone. Well, here's the thing. That restaurant is Snake Flower Triad Turf. The chances of that waiter being one of them is 99.9%, and even then, that was an act of self-defense done in the territory of people who kidnapped a child that's important to Kiryu. Very different situation from the Yakuza 0 example earlier, where he straight up was just doing a criminal's job. And even then, that debt collecting example isn't even anything that twisted. It's a very basic, surface level job compared to the other things we hear about in the franchise from time to time. So in just about all the games, we see different little or big acts or speeches from Kiryu that show us that he had nobler intentions than most members of the Yakuza, thus giving him a harder time to fit in with the rest. This slowly shifts onto him wanting to move away from that life, especially after meeting Haruka. With her around, he had a new reason to live, especially after everything and everyone he lost in the events of the first game. But see, that's where the crux of today's topic comes in. Going forward from the point we just mentioned, the end of Yakuza 1, all throughout the rest of the franchise, there are many instances where Kiryu, trying to move on with his life, does what he thinks is right, but is either completely oblivious to the consequences that follow, or maybe even just doesn't want to think about the long term. And this unfortunately felt like it was not sufficiently addressed in the games for the longest time, despite being something that, in my opinion, should have been a subject of focus in one of the earlier entries. Even in the community, it feels like it's only in the past few years that more and more people realize just how much of a hypocrite Kiryu can be. Though in his defense here, we've always been told that Kiryu's a stubborn man. This goes back as early as the very first game, where Shinji tells Kazuki that it's useless to try and change Kiryu's mind. But setting all that aside, we'll be going through moments and/or decisions Kiryu has made that highlight the hypocritical side of him leading up to Infinite Wealth, where it's finally been called out and potentially resolved for the most part, in a way that should, in my opinion, be appreciated more purely because of how well it was done compared to any other instance, if there even was a comparable instance. At the end of the first Yakuza game, before facing Jingu, Kiryu has a powerful scene in which he displays Masaru Sera's will that chooses him as a successor to the Tojo Clan. There is a flashback cut in multiple parts where we see that this choice was left to Kazuma, who picks Kiryu for the position. Once he defeats Jingu and shortly after Nishiki, a very unfortunate turn of events occurs where Jingu comes back to kill everyone, and he succeeds in killing Yumi, but before he kills anyone else, Nishiki stops him, but he takes his own life shortly after. After losing two of the most important people in his life, and a third one being Kazuma a chapter ago, Kiryu is left feeling complete emptiness. The police show up on the scene, and he doesn't care what happens to him next. He doesn't care if he gets arrested and locked up for life. But then Date tries to talk some sense into him, telling him that even now, there's something he can still do, looking after Haruka. After all, she has no one to turn to anymore. This is very likely the biggest reason why Kiryu decides to drop out of the 4th chairman position from the Tojo Clan, even though he barely spent any time with it, and assigns someone else so he can move on with his life and look after Haruka. This doesn't stop the idea of Kiryu abandoning the Tojo Clan so quick from being funny as hell though, and to this day it remains a meme. I mean, after seeing this, think back to that suffocating air of urgency and dead seriousness in the room where Sera and Kazuma were trying to pick the successor. If they could comment at the moment Kiryu left, they'd probably be looking down at him right now just going, motherfucker. And it's doubly hilarious when you consider who Kiryu picks for the chairman position. Of course, we know that it's none other than Terada, a man that we're told is indebted to Kazuma, as we've seen him look after him during the first game. In Yakuza 2, 1 year after the events of the first game, Kiryu is still having nightmares about the day he lost the people important to him, but we see that he's doing relatively well with Haruka around, until Terada comes knocking and begs Kiryu to handle some matters with the Tojo and the Omi clans. The Tojo clan is almost literally in shambles because they just can't help but be the incompetent clan trademark. Now, what does Kiryu have to do through the course of the game? Well, the first thing he does is he drags Daigo Dojima, the son of his former Yakuza boss, into the Tojo clan in an attempt to make him take the reins. One could argue that this may have been for the best, seeing as Daigo was just kind of wandering around aimlessly as a thug. But couldn't you argue that he could have just helped Daigo without making it about the Tojo clan? Daigo, once again, is the son of Kiryu's former boss, and as we've seen in Zero, they got along well and was somewhat important to Kiryu. You could chalk this one up to prequel issues, I suppose, but still, the point remains. Kiryu only went to him just so someone could help the Tojo clan get back on its feet. And of course, he did it in the only way he could, beating the shit out of Daigo, aka basically forcing him to do it. I might go on a slight tangent here, but years ago, I'd say before Yakuza 0 blew up, that would make it about before 2017. One of the biggest Yakuza memes was Daigo being incompetent as a Tojo clan leader. You see him get beat quite a bit in Yakuza 2, bad things happen to him in 3, and a bunch of other examples in 4 and 5 as well. But this is one of those things that as time went on, people also started to see just how dumb Kiryu can be as well. For starters, it wasn't Daigo's first choice to become the head of an organization of like, what, 30,000 criminals? He was beat up because he didn't like the idea and got coerced into it. And with Kiryu, we're talking about a guy who said he's done with the Tojo, relinquished his title of 4th chairman within 5 minutes, and already in the second game he comes back and has a major hand in helping them with management issues and sorting out a war with another faction. He helps them the most in Yakuza 2 out of any other sequel. Like, seriously, he single-handedly does almost everything for the Tojo Clan in this game because of how helpless they are. It's hilarious. So much for Haruka, I guess. I've had a post that was meant to gauge how people felt about Daigo recently, and only like 3 in 100 think that Daigo was genuinely a bad leader to the Tojo Clan. So clearly, public opinion of him shifted greatly since the time period I mentioned earlier. I am proud of this community. Anyway, next, the Tojo needs extra help. So what does Kiryu do? Doing what he does best, of course. He'll drag someone else back into the Tojo Clan so that they don't get to move on, but he does. That's right, this time we're talking about Majima. Much like Daigo, he was also very reluctant about the idea, but Kiryu begged him, and Majima basically took pity on him and said okay, on the condition that they fight. You're probably thinking, okay, well, despite everything, both Daigo and Majima ended up saying okay. And I mean, yeah, you're not wrong, but bear with me for some time. I'm trying to take us up this hill showing the enormous amount of favors Kiryu's asked of other people throughout the franchise, or just acts of heartwarming goodwill from others towards him done without even being spoken to. And yet, at times that we'll talk about later, it almost feels like he doesn't truly feel grateful to them about it at all. In Yakuza 2, for example, Daigo and Majima go back and help the Tojo, and this either directly or indirectly, depending on how you look at it, helps Kiryu move on with his life after the events of this game and also Yakuza 3. And already with Yakuza 2, we've seen that Majima gave up his newfound freedom away from the Tojo just to help Kiryu out and in turn help the clan out. You'd think this would make Kiryu relate heavily to Majima down the line, but I guess not. And mind you, Majima gets fucked up in this game at some point. Look at this guy. That's the look of someone who went above and beyond trying to hold his end of the bargain. But anyway, this should be enough about Yakuza 2. We'll just move on to what's relevant to the topic in Yakuza 3. Yakuza 3 as well, to no one's surprise I think, shows us just how much Daigo and Majima have done for Kiryu just so he could move away and live a new life. Like, you know, for realsies this time. Surely he's not gonna come back to the Tojo and help them out again. The game literally starts with Daigo refusing a deal that involved taking over the land Kiryu's orphanage is in. Keep in mind, Daigo's subordinate mentions that the amount of money they were gonna get out of that deal would last them for at least a decade. And still, without hesitation, Daigo called the deal off and even cancelled his plans for that evening and went back to the Tojo Clan to make sure that no one would accept the deal on his behalf behind his back. And he gets shot for not being on board. We go back in time a little bit to show a bit of what happens right after the events of 2. Still at the start of the game, Kiryu asks Majima once again to look after the Tojo and Daigo while he's gone. Majima, just like in Yakuza 2, wasn't really thrilled at the idea, but agreed to it on the condition of a fight.
도저 가는 것도頼んだぞ.
I swear to God, dude, there are multiple scenes throughout this game where we see Majima looking absolutely dead inside. Like he wants less than nothing to do with the Tojo Clan and all the organized crime deals. Just look at him. And I thought I look dead when I wake up. God damn.
Huh? 俺は別にどうでもええ。あんたらで好きにやってくれや。風間のおっさんの亡霊探すもよし、桐生ちゃんとドンパチするのもよし、好きにせえ。桐生ちゃん、えらいことになったで。
Call me stupid. I'm stupid sometimes, I can't lie. But going back and seeing moments like this was kind of a reality check for me. I mean, how many of us gave these kinds of moments much thought? Let me know in the comments, because I feel like this is one of those things that we tend to forget an hour later, but you would think it would take its toll on someone like Majima sooner or later, and it would likely crash at some point. And of course, we can't forget about that infamous pink truck scene where Majima rushes into the rescue and bails Kiryu out of a tight spot against government agents. It's not difficult to see that despite having a favor that drains the life out of him, Majima still respects Kiryu enough to do what he can, and still has the energy to rescue him in this situation, and that sort of gave me a newfound admiration for him. Because remember, whereas Majima is sort of just holding his end of the bargain even now, Kiryu is just going around doing whatever he feels like. You think Majima is depressed as hell because of his own life in games like 3, 4, and 5? No, turns out all this time, it's because Kiryu's done nothing but steal his life away from him. Change my mind. Do it. You think Majima wants to leave behind his newfound ownership of Purgatory, an area with its own fighting arena, just to deal with some random poop face from the Poopy Fart clan? Checkmate! There's one more thing I want to mention that is pretty easy to miss. There's one cutscene where Hamazaki and Majima are in a meeting. Hamazaki reveals that he proposed a 100 billion yen deal to Majima if they managed to get the deed to Kiryu's land. Majima didn't say anything during this whole meeting, so it's not like he was completely on board, but it did remind me of Daigo's situation in 4, which we'll get to in a bit. Majima probably just doesn't care about any of what's going on, so he didn't give the deal any serious consideration. Yakuza 4 is one of the few games where Kiryu has the least overall involvement, and yet at the same time he still does show concern for the Tojo Clan. He just can't make up his mind. So, certain events have Kiryu come back to Kamurocho once again, and he stumbles upon an unexpected scene, Majima in cuffs being taken to a police car. When Kiryu gets his attention, Majima says that Daigo is responsible for this. We then cut to a scene with Daigo and Munakata discussing what just happened. I'll spare you the excess, but please do correct me if I'm wrong or forgot something, because we all know how beautiful and clean Yakuza 4's story is. The reason why this happened is because during the events of the game, the Tojo Clan has this rivalry with the Ueno Saiwa clan, and Munakata offered to completely get rid of them as soon as Daigo says the word, and in exchange, Arai, a spy working for Munakata, gets promoted to captain within the Tojo so that Munakata has more influence in the crime world. My guess is Majima getting arrested was likely a part of that deal to stop him from interfering with this, being the kind of Yakuza that prefers to settle things the classic way. War. So essentially, Munakata was just offering a shortcut to Daigo. This would also ensure that Daigo has very strong connections to the police, and if he needed any favors from them, well, now he has an extra insider if he didn't already have one. Now, I know it's super easy to jump on the wagon and just take a dump on Daigo for all this, but this guy is trying to hold the leash on 30,000 Yakuza members, and we all know that in that environment, not all of them are on the same wavelength. You could have a guy planning a coup any goddamn second of the day. And we've seen this a lot in Yakuza 2, 3, and 5 to name a few games. You know that dead inside look that I mentioned Majima having in Yakuza 3? Well, Daigo here has that very same look, except just kinda angrier. Honestly, I could make a whole video on why Daigo gets more shit than he deserves. He took control of the Tojo Clan at like age 30? He was 30 in the events of 2, and I assume he took control either right after or soon after. Despite the fact that this guy was lacking experience that other leaders had, like, you know what? I'm kinda just realizing how horrible like every other chairman we've seen were at their jobs. I wanted to compare him to someone else that's experienced, but like, we've seen like 10 minutes of Tirada thanks to the Majima Saga and Kiwami 2, but like, 9 of those minutes were just him sitting there looking like this emoji. They got absolutely bullied during the temporary leadership of Yayoi Dojima. Kiryu didn't want to do shit with the Tojo on the first day of his promotion. Chairman Sarah just kinda died, and the Tojo was an absolute shit show during his reign. The only chairman I would say that showed admirable traits was Nihara in Yakuza 0, which is funny because I don't think he was the actual chairman. He was the acting chairman at the time. We've gotten a good look at the mannerisms he has for a man in his position, the way he speaks, the way he negotiates during his deal with Tachibana. Despite his old age, he carries himself with dignity that demands respect. He speaks like a true leader of the world of crime, and it shows. And despite that, even he couldn't keep the clan at bay when he wanted. Just because it's practically impossible when you have an organization of this size. You'll have underlings that just want to discreetly disobey for their own interests. And we've seen this when Tachibana successfully negotiated his deal to basically buy Kiryu's life and ask Nihara to keep the Tojo's hands away from him. Dojima didn't really care. The next best thing we have, I would say, is Daigo. Say what you will, but he kept the clan running longer than every chairman we've come to know, despite being appointed at the age of 30. But let's save the Daigo talk for another video perhaps. Honestly, the only real reason you'd probably hate any of the leaders is probably just personal preference at this point, because like all of them had fuck-ups. So at the end of Yakuza 4, Kiryu decides, alright Daigo, I'm gonna teach you what it means to lead the Tojo Clan. No, seriously, can you say that again? Okay, I know Kiryu means well, and he just wanted to make sure Daigo didn't get too crazy with his position, but this doesn't stop it from being one of the funniest things in the whole franchise. Also, in Kiryu's defense, let me add a bit more context. Perhaps I misrepresented him, right? Let's see what he has to say in one segment.
お前には悪かったと思ってる。登場会をお前一人に押し付けたのは俺の責任だ。だから俺もう逃げない。俺なりのけじめはつけるつもりだ。
Okay, Kiryu, you had a really solid start there about how this was on you and how Daigo basically had no one to guide him every now and then. But then you just had to drop the biggest cap. But no, I'm done running. I'm taking responsibility. If you're watching this, you probably know what happens. But if you don't, then yeah, once the game is over, Kiryu goes back to Okinawa like nothing happened. I'm not saying Daigo's actions in 4 were justified by any means, but considering how hard he got screwed in Yakuza 3, I can honestly sort of see where this sudden outburst of his in Yakuza 4 comes from. I'm no crime boss, I swear. But it can be easy being in this guy's position. Make the wrong enemy at the wrong time and you're probably finished. And you know, Yakuza 4 actually ties in with Yakuza 7 more than I realized, now that I think about it. I'll be talking about that game on its own later, but think about it. In 7, they decided to completely disband the Tojo and the Omi clans because it was a time where, thanks to all the anti-crime laws, the Yakuza were reduced to being easily controlled by politicians and the government for their interests. So in hindsight, it wasn't just Ryo Aoki making use of that, but Munakata as well. One more thing about Yakuza 4 as well. I feel like people forget that Daigo is the leader of a criminal organization, so turning Majima over to the police so he could potentially get the best case scenario out of a deal? Who would have thought? It's not like that was his most preferred choice either. One look at the negotiation cutscene will tell you that. Besides, it's totally not like the Majima family is the one family that Tojo has that matters, right? Hey, name one other big Tojo family in Yakuza 4. I'm waiting. Also, compared to what Daigo did in 4, it is curious how people easily overlook a case such as Arakawa. The guy sent Ichiban to jail in Masato's place for 18 years, and the next time they see each other, he literally had full intent to kill Ichiban, just because he was interrupting an important business meeting with the Omi, and he wanted to make sure it goes smoothly. So if we all understand that Arakawa was doing what he had to, even if it was extreme, then surely we can also understand where Daigo was coming from when he sent Majima to jail in 4. Before we move on to Yakuza 5, actually, hi, how are you doing? I hope you're enjoying the video, and I hope you're also having a good day. If you're not, I'm sorry to hear that, but I sincerely hope that things do get better for you, and I hope that this video, or my videos in general, you know, help out a little with that. I'd very briefly like to talk about a sponsor, and I'll make it quick, I promise. Want to try out a refreshing and healthy drink for your gaming sessions? Check out Gamersupps. Plenty of flavors, 0 sugar and 0 calories. They recently added more stuff too, like tea, cup noodles, and more flavors for their snack bars. Use my link in the description or the code DEVILEON7 upon checking out to get 10% off. In doing that, you'll help me in the process too. Thank you for listening, and now we're back to the video. Next, we go to Yakuza 5. Oh boy, does this game have a tale or two. This game is probably the height of Kiryu's struggle with "I've left that life behind" versus, you know what? Being Yakuza is kinda epic. So, Kiryu was convinced that him being around his kids will crush their futures because they would be associated with his past. So, he leaves behind everything he worked towards for the past 4 games. And I don't want to get into whether or not that was a good idea in this video, because I'm just going to probably rant about general gripes with the Yakuza 5 story, and that's a topic for another video. For now, I just want to focus on the topic at hand, that being Kiryu leaving his past with the Tojo, trying to move on, and how decisions he made along that way make him a massive, unintentional hypocrite that's not the most considerate of the people around him. The game opens with Daigo trying to form an alliance with the Yamagasa family all the way out in Fukuoka. He handles the meeting with Patriarch Madarame professionally. Despite having over 30,000 men working under him, he still shows the utmost respect to this guy who only has 500 men. Madarame admires Daigo's elegance with handling the alliance request and says he'll have his answer in about a week. Fast forward a bit. Kiryu is now a taxi driver in the same area. People will usually tell you that this is his biggest depression arc. He always looks either, well, depressed or annoyed. More so than most other games. Though at this point I feel like Infinite Wealth, Gaiden, and 6 are also great contenders for that title. And 1, And 0. Okay, you know what? Let's move on. One day, Daigo gets in Kiryu's taxi car and tries to ask about how Kiryu's doing with his new life. Then he talks about how the Tojo is doing and that there's this war he's trying to prevent, and he's trying to form alliances all over the country to help their cause. Kiryu does not care in the slightest. At least, not yet. In Kiryu's defense, being basically kicked out of the orphanage because he was told his past was gonna get in the way, he probably wanted nothing to do with the Tojo, even more so than he usually claims. But like, it's Daigo, dude. You call this guy your son later. I think just trying to say a few things would have been nice. Unless maybe the taxi's rigged with a security camera or something, which I don't think it is. Kiryu pulls up without Daigo telling him to, so basically he's telling him to get the hell out. With nothing much gained from the conversation, Daigo says that it might not seem like it, but he's doing his best with handling things alone before he leaves the taxi. Man, as you might have figured, I had to go back and rewatch some scenes for this video in general, but going back to watch this was kinda brutal. I felt bad for Daigo. This probably marks the first real point where Kiryu responded like a complete asshole, especially after everything's Daigo done for him over the years. I get that you want to wash your hands from your Yakuza past, but that was a horrible way to handle that conversation. Maybe at some parts of this video you were thinking, okay, but why does Kiryu have to do anything for Daigo? And the answer, or my answer at least, is that he doesn't have to do anything, but you would think that if you nominate someone for an important, life-changing position, in a very crude manner no less, then you'd probably be there for them when they need you to just hear them out for a bit. And maybe it seems like so far I'm trying to say that Kiryu's basically done nothing back for some of the people that have done something for him. And okay, you know what? There may be some truth to that. Think about it. In the games we've covered so far, everything Kiryu's done to help out in a game like Yakuza 2, for example, was ultimately for the interest of the Tojo Clan more than anything else. We see the same thing in Yakuza 4. Yakuza 3 might be a bit of an exception because he wasn't focused on the Tojo Clan as much as he was on protecting the orphanage. Majima, who we know was trying to put the Tojo behind him in 2, was brought back so he could stand guard while Kiryu was away. Daigo, as we've also discussed already, got basically the same treatment. And here's the bottom line. You don't put people back in positions like that for their own interest. In Kiryu's head, he was probably thinking that that was the best course of action so he could move on with his life, but why would he care so much about what the Tojo does if he's planning to make an attempt to move on anyway? Doing what he did, he was setting himself up to just eventually come back for something. Meanwhile, the favors both Majima and Daigo have done for Kiryu was all for his personal interest, so he could actually focus on his life and do whatever he wanted to do. So yes, while I do think that Kiryu shares a relationship of respect with people like Majima and Daigo, it's hard to deny how selfish he comes off as a lot of the time. Which is a funny paradox, because by often looking out for the Tojo Clan, it's also a bit of a selfless effort. It's like an abusive ex-lover. You know you shouldn't think about them anymore, but some people just can't help themselves. Kiryu did, after all, spend a good chunk of his life with the Tojo. But anyway, moving on. After that conversation in the taxi, Daigo goes missing and 2 Tojo guys, Morinaga and Aizawa, approach Kiryu asking if he knows where he went. Kiryu says they're asking the wrong guy, he's just a civilian and blah blah. You know, Kiryu's song and dance in situations like this. I never thought I'd say this, but Aizawa made an excellent point before a fight breaks out.
あんたそれでも男かよ。堂島会長は友達じゃねえのか。
愛沢。
どういう事情があるんだか知らねえが。どうしてそこまで白切り通すんだよ。
Daigo disappears for a good chunk of the game after that conversation in the taxi. He shows up again way later to save the day, or so you think, until he also gets shot in the same scene. And this is where Kiryu's like,
"Oh, Daigo, my son, how could they do this to you?"
I'm sorry. I just can't help it. This scene is hilarious for like 10 other reasons for me, but this is one of them. It's a bit late to finally show that concern, Kiryu.
どうして誰かが犠牲にならなきゃならないんだ。
Gee, I don't know. Maybe this someone that just got shot was someone you basically signed up for this kind of situation 3 games ago? Oh my god, Kiryu. He literally used the worst example to question as to why this is happening. If this was someone he knew that was just a civilian that had nothing to do with the Yakuza, this scene would have something going for it. But it's the complete opposite.
遅すぎるんですよ。あなたはいつも遅すぎる。だからこうなるんです。
In Kiryu's defense though, they do also mention going after Haruka. That's about the only valid thing going for the scene. Which is funny because him staying away from the orphanage did fuck all for this game. Mainly because he had to throw himself into the gears of Yakuza conflict again. And now Haruka's in the middle of all of this. So, good job Kiryu. Not only did you undo previous games worth of work, but you also undid this game's worth of work. So, as you know or could tell, by the end of his arc and also the game, Kiryu gets almost as involved with the Tojo as he was in Yakuza 2. Majima also goes through his own personal hell to help Kiryu, again, getting blackmailed by Kurosawa into submission so he could stop Haruka from being sniped at her idol debut concert. Majima does like almost nothing else in this game, by the way, except get written into a marriage, but that's also a topic for another time. In Yakuza 6, for what feels like truly the first time in his life, Kiryu legitimately seems like he wants less than nothing to do with the Tojo. And I don't mean in the same way as in Yakuza 5 where he went as far as to turn Daigo away from having a conversation and pretended not to know him until it was too late, but as in he acknowledges his past and at the same time tries not to be involved to protect his orphanage. Similar to Yakuza 3 in a way. Until... No, Kiryu! Oh my god, Kiryu, make up your fucking mind. In all seriousness, this particular line was said in a context of protecting people close to him rather than doing anything for the clan. Somiya basically just revealed that he was part of the reason why Daigo's in jail during the events of this game. In fact, in this same conversation, Kiryu reminisces about Daigo, knowing him since he was a child, dragging him to be the 6th chairman, and you know all that good stuff. This was honestly very sweet of Kiryu, and I really liked this. So of course, Somiya was gonna get a beating for that. Rewinding a good chunk at the very beginning of the game during the dream segment, Kiryu has this to say about Daigo.
4代目大悟かつて俺の都政の親であり東上界の大幹部だった堂島宗平の一人息子極道の世界から距離を置いていた大悟に俺は東上界の6代目会長という重荷を背負わせてしまっただが2万5000の子分を抱える東上界を束ねていけるのは堂島大悟を置いて他にいない俺はそう信じ大悟もまたそれを証明してきた
Yakuza 6 is definitely the point where Kiryu starts to become somewhat self-aware, at least in regards to how he affected or affects people around him. And if that wasn't proof enough of that, the ending has a very special something, one of my favorite moments in the franchise, that I'm sure all of you who played know what I'm talking about, that letter to Daigo.
俺はお前の親としてそばにいてやる必要はないと思っていた堂島大悟を男と見込んでお前に全てを託していたと言えば聞こえはいいだが俺はお前と持つべきだった親と子の時間を捨てて運命と向き合わず消せない過去からも目を背けそんな俺がお前や登場界の親だと名乗る資格はない
I do think Daigo deserves every bit of this letter, but I gotta say though, some words to Majima would have been nice considering he also sacrificed a good bit to help Kiryu. But anyway, after 6, we know that Kiryu joins the Daidoji faction as an agent, and things once again change for him. Yakuza 7, or Yakuza Like a Dragon, has very little of Kiryu, but seeing him help out with the Tojo dissolution is nice, even if it's a bit weird that he would show himself after being sworn to secrecy. This was all Watase's idea, surprisingly, and it caught people participating in the dissolution off guard. So the 3 Jimas, as people call them, as in Dojima Daigo, Saijima, Majima, so Jima, three Jimas, they were all pleasantly surprised to see Kiryu there. I mentioned earlier while talking about Yakuza 4 that government officials like Ryo Aoki were using the Yakuza as puppets for their own interests at this point of time. My guy was literally just shooting anyone that stood in the way of him getting elected. Couple that with the fact that the country laws are trying harder and harder each year on cracking down the existence of the Yakuza and their activities. This immense pressure and constantly being on a tight leash made Daigo and Watase decide that the best course of action is to break up 2 of the biggest clans, and they also planned ahead of that by securing a job for all the now jobless Yakuza at a security firm that they were planning to establish. That's about all we hear with Yakuza 7 that's relevant to this topic. We get a bit more context on this in Gaiden. We see that Kiryu initially didn't want anything to do with the dissolution because, as you might have guessed, He doesn't want anything to do with the Tojo. Two of Watase's best men were the ones to relay this message about the dissolution to him, those being Tsuruno and Shishido. The thing is, they weren't exactly being the most hospitable about it at first. This leads to a chain of events that I think could have been easily avoided, but that's also a topic for another time. Kiryu eventually comes around and helps out with the process, so we see that whole scene at the Omi clan from Kiryu's perspective, and how exactly the aftermath of it went for him and the other Tojo guys, which is something we don't see in 7. Kiryu lets the agent facade drop a bit, especially when confronting Shishido's vehement denial of the situation, and we end up having a very old-fashioned series of fights, a clash of ideals. Unfortunately, that's about all that Kiryu does. He had no problems showing himself out in the open in 7, and also showing himself in a room full of seasoned Omi officers who would have 100% recognized him, but he just kinda dipped after this. So the cleanup job was left to Watase, Daigo, Saejima, and Majima. Once again, this brings up the issue of how it feels like Kiryu never really knows whether he wants to help his Yakuza friends or whether he truly wants to move on. I don't have an issue with in-betweens and nuance in fiction. I love seeing conflicting motivations or mindsets if they're done well. Hell, I would have been fine with Kiryu not knowing what to do for an arc. The issue is, that's still the arc, almost 20 years later, and it's been that way since like game 2. Kiryu still doesn't know what he wants to do. It's like this poor man was just destined to be in the middle, being torn apart by multiple places where he belongs. Even with what I said, some of you may be thinking that he can't do what he wants because the Daidoji prevents him from doing so, but I really don't think that holds up as an argument for reasons already stated. Showing up in a room full of Omi officers is a surefire way to blow your cover, and probably have some form of breach of contract with the Daidoji. Not only that, but him not making an effort to don a different look in 7 in broad daylight and while interacting with Ichiban just doesn't make sense. The reality is that Kiryu can do whatever he wants to do even with the Daidoji watching him. It's just a matter of whether the writing allows him to. And we've sort of seen that in Infinite Wealth. No, Date! No, Date! God damn it! Kiryuin. What the hell is a Kiryuin? We've all seen how much of a meme it is with Gaiden as well, that everybody's like, oh, you're Kazuma Kiryu, and he goes, you've got the wrong person. This also comes up in Infinite Wealth outside of Japan. So speaking of Infinite Wealth, we'll finally move on to that game now. Everything I've been saying up until now culminates at and crashes with Infinite Wealth. If you've been watching intently up until this point, let me just say thank you. This is something that I feel like is inevitable because this video basically takes a while to build things up until this point. There's bound to be someone that might wonder what I'm leading at all this time, but as previously mentioned, this is where it unfolds. Like a Dragon, Infinite Wealth puts Kiryu in very interesting situations. First of all, we find out really early that he's battling with cancer, which is mainly why he's not as strong as he used to be. Because of that, he has to rely more on the assistance of people around him, and he comes to see the value of that. And I really like that aspect of the game. For once, Kiryu's seeing things very differently, sort of literally too, as he starts seeing enemies in an exaggerated manner like Ichiban does. I'm not really gonna talk too much about the details of the plot because that's not the main focus here. But to put it simply, a lot of things happen. Shit hits the fan and Kiryu needs all the help he can get. He decides to seek the help of a certain group of Tojo legends, the Treizimas. The last time they spoke was during the dissolution we've seen in Gaiden and 7, and it's been 4 years since then. He makes a trip to where they currently live, and we learn quickly that the security firm they plan to establish to give a place for all the ex-Yakuza didn't really work out. It fell under after about a year. A prominent reason for that being how former members of the Yakuza have this stigma to them that makes society want to avoid being associated with them in any way, shape, or form. This is likely why they went as far as to move so far away from society, being in an extremely remote location. The truck driver giving Kiryu and friends a lift points this out too, saying almost no one ever goes here. Normally, that stigma I talked about by itself isn't enough of a reason to drive someone to be shunned to an extreme extent. The reason they moved so far away was, well, a VTuber, Tatara, exposing their pasts and their dealings that were supposed to help them move on with a new life. This made people want nothing to do with them on an even bigger scale. Believe it or not, according to a friend of mine who is fluent in Japanese, who also immerses themselves in the culture quite a lot, this is a pretty real thing, whether it's in VTuber format or just a voice changer or what have you. It's a funny thing, isn't it? Stuff like the nuclear material trafficking plot point of this game also shockingly turning out to be something that happened in real life recently, and there's the coin locker baby phenomenon, which you also see in Japanese fiction and real stories as well. Someone on Twitter told me that there's a whole commentary book on this topic. Pretty damn wild. How does RGG Studio do this? Anyway, back to the topic at hand. Before I talk about Kiryu asking the guys for help, I do want to briefly touch on something that happened in this scene earlier. Kiryu brings up the fact that he has cancer, and the reactions you see are pretty interesting. This is the kind of thing that gets people talking. So, pretty late into the creation of this video, I've seen a post about how Majima's reaction is out of character, and I wanted to add this segment because of that, because it is absolutely relevant, and I wanted to explain how I viewed it. After Kiryu breaks the news, Daigo is the one to show the most concern and emotion, while Saejima and Majima look barely phased on the surface, and Majima in particular has this to say.
堂島の竜も病気には勝てんか
This may sound cold, but don't forget, these are also the same guys that had basically the same reaction when he quote-unquote died in Yakuza 6. It wasn't hard to tell that they were bothered even then. The air in that car was deathly serious. Having said that though, I do feel like this time, it's different. One look at these guys now will tell you just how tired of life they are. They just don't have the same energy to care about much. And knowing what they all went through, it's easy to understand why they're the way they are now. Plus, couple that with the fact that almost every fucking time Kiryu shows up at their doorstep, it's to ask for a favor that involves putting them in harm's way, as this video has tried to demonstrate. If I was in Majima's position, I would probably say the same thing, honestly. And again, I don't think Majima didn't care because he most definitely shows concern soon. And also something that comes up in this conversation is Kiryu's general stubborn nature. Majima knows that Kiryu made his peace with however he wanted to live his life. So if anything, I think this shows great consistency with a trait of Kiryu's that has been shown time and time again, and just how familiar Majima is with him. In Yakuza 3, it's also Majima that reminds Date of how stubborn Kiryu is, and that once he's made his decision, he doesn't go back. Consider all of what this video is trying to say, and I think it'll all make sense. And we'll touch upon it even more in what's left of the video. Kiryu wants the three Jimas to help Sawashiro make sure a second dissolution goes through the Seiryu clan, and that would entail stopping Ebina. The problem is, the way Kiryu words his request could not be more inconsiderate. Seriously, try watching The Room here. He goes, word for word, "You all started it. The second great dissolution should be yours to finish." Now, I don't know about you guys, but from where I'm standing, these three have literally no reason to care about what the Yakuza do anymore. The Tojo and the Omi are gone. They've done their jobs with that. Taking down other clans with them is far from their responsibility, but Kiryu seems to think otherwise. Kiryu seems to think that he's taking some responsibility. But like, the problem with the responsibility topic is that I feel like Kiryu doesn't understand what should and shouldn't be considered a responsibility at this point. Right now, you might be thinking, oh, but wait, Leon, the thing he says after the cutscene, oh wait, don't worry, I know about that. I'm saying all this knowing full well about that, and we'll get to that soon. I have not seen a better example of expressions that scream, "You can't be fucking serious right now," without them actually saying anything. The guys try refusing nicely at first, but Kiryu basically keeps insisting that this is also their job, so eventually he gets fed up and gets up to leave. He says that no matter how much they want to deny it, what they're doing right now is running away. Wow, running away. Now, where have I seen that? Oh, right. Just about every single fucking game in one way or another. I love Kiryu, but my goodness, the audacity on this bitch. But because this happened, we finally get something that we should have gotten earlier, in my opinion. Daigo gets up, yells about how he has no idea what he's talking about and what they all went through all these years. Now Kiryu, of course being the smartass he is, he just goes, "Yeah, can relate." Majima and Saejima also get up after this and they rightfully want to throw hands. After an incredible fight, Kiryu gets up to ask what's stopping them from helping out. Is it that they're scared they're gonna mess up something again? He says that they just gotta keep trying. I feel like this isn't even relevant to what the problem truly is, but yeah, sure. As Kiryu walks away, Daigo tells him that he doesn't have much longer to live. That all this isn't worth spending the rest of his time for, which I think is an excellent point personally, and that there's no reason he should just basically get himself killed like this. Kiryu then says that his death will finally mean something, though I'm not 100% sure what exactly he's referring to. Is it that by helping the Yakuza out once again, people, especially the Yakuza, will have something to admire him for? Because this dude already is the most legendary Yakuza to ever live. He mentions soon after this that he ruined the lives of a lot of people, which this self-awareness is always nice to see. But then he says that despite all of that, he's still standing. So is his death going to be an act of repentance for that? And that's why he thinks it's gonna have value? The important question is, when he says that he ruined lives, why doesn't he acknowledge Majima and Daigo in that, especially Daigo? These two did so much for him. He says that the Yakuza made a big mess this time around and he's gonna grab a hold of it and take it with him, but I just don't get why go out of his way to basically repeat the same song and dance he's done for the past every single fucking game. Like at this point, even he knows that there's this mysterious force that has a power over him and it compels him to go back to the Yakuza world every single time and stick his nose where it doesn't really need to be. And now, for one sentence that, in my opinion, has the illusion of being a powerful emotional statement, but in my opinion is proof of something that I never thought I would bring up. So before he leaves, this is what he says.
ここに来たのも本当は最後にお前らと喧嘩してみたかっただけなのかもしれねえな。桐生さん。
This sentence is sweet. It's wonderfully heartwarming, nostalgic, and he can't help but think of all the times he fought these guys before for whatever reasons they had to fight each other. With guys of Herculean strength like these, fighting is just one way to bond with each other. So it makes perfect sense why he might want to say and do something like this. But it also made me think of something else at the same time. The thing that I was just talking about before showing the scene. This portrays Kiryu as a masterful, unintentional, emotional manipulator. And I know what you're thinking. Holy shit, Leon, I knew you were cringe, but not this cringe. Hear me out. I'm not saying this is all one objective fact. I'm just presenting a different way to view all this, a semi-humorous one, in a way that I feel like makes sense. Maybe you see where I'm coming from, maybe you don't. Either is fine, and the beauty of this is that we can all discuss everything about this. Now hear me out. For the first time in I don't know how long, he got all three of these guys to show genuine, sincere sadness about his current situation. More sadness and concern than they'd ever shown before. It puts that car ride in Yakuza 6 to shame, with the dead silence and blank expressions at the alleged news of his death. Majima looks like he's on the verge of tears. Seeing all of this makes you forget everything he's just said to them, about responsibility and possibly everything I've been talking about up until this point in the video. But is that something we should dismiss so easily? There are two things that are worth exploring after this question. Or actually, maybe they're one and the same, because it sort of is a cycle. But before we get into that, you might still be clinging onto the idea that Kiryu didn't really need their help and he really went to them purely just to fight them for the last time. Fair enough, but I still beg to differ on that one. He absolutely needed all the help he can get for reasons that should be obvious, but might have gotten muddied with the emotional wave of this part. This guy has cancer. He's not as strong as he used to be. The story made it a point to show that again and again. You'd have to completely dismiss that if you still fully believe that he didn't really want their help. Even with the help he has with his party members, he still needs more to go against the Kiryu clan. Just think about that one scene in the final long battle for Kiryu and how much of a gigantic ray of hope the scene of the three Jimas showing up was. It was incredibly exciting. It fondles your heartstrings so beautifully. Seeing them save the day the way they did, it felt like Kiryu himself got a whole new surge of nostalgic energy that fueled him for the rest of this segment. Bearing that in mind, if Kiryu despises the idea of dragging people into his problems and therefore ruining their lives, then why does he want to drag the three Jimas once again into problems they've washed their hands from? It goes back into what we talked about earlier. Whenever Kiryu wanted to move on with his life, none of these guys said jack shit about that. None of them ever gave him shit for it. None of them tried to manipulate him into thinking that what he's doing is wrong. In fact, they helped him start anew. We know that in Yakuza 2, Daigo took the reins of the Tojo at the coercion of Kiryu and dragged Majima back into the Tojo as well. And what happened at the end of the game? Kiryu just moves on with his life and leaves them behind. In Yakuza 3, Majima remained in the Tojo to keep watch over things, and Daigo literally took a bullet for this guy in his orphanage, refused a shit ton of money in the process too. All so Kiryu could live peacefully without worrying about any threats. When these guys want to do the same, suddenly it's wrong and they have a responsibility to take care of, despite the fact that they technically already did their part with the first dissolution. I have no idea where Kiryu gets off telling these guys who watched over him their whole lives that they're wrong and he's right. You know what else is hilarious? When Kiryu pays a visit to the Treijimas, it starts with him telling Daigo, "I'm not here to tell you whether you made the right choices." And this turns to, "But you know what I can tell you? You have a responsibility, bozo, get your ass moving." Kiryu despises dragging others into his problems so much, he had no issues dragging Daigo and Majima back into the Tojo so he could fuck off. You probably could tell, but I just don't know how much I believe Kiryu on that one. Maybe he really does have the best intentions, but holy shit, he sucks at conveying them. Speaking of, if there is one thing I adored about Ebina, despite any and all criticism about him, it's the speech he gives at the end of the game after you fight him, and how it felt almost meta. As you could tell probably by the title of the video and what I've been saying up until this point, one of my favorite plot devices is people calling out Kiryu on his hypocrisy. The issue is, it almost never leads anywhere. Ebina called out the fact that not just Kiryu, but even others keep coming back again and again and again, whether they retire or disband, and it's a cycle that never ends. Despite washing his hands from the Yakuza countless times, Kiryu just can't help himself. He'll say it's up to him and help the Tojo or whoever again. He is literally incapable of moving on. Credit where it's due though, we have another self-awareness moment. Kiryu does mention before the fight that when he became 4th chairman, he had the chance to change the clan for the better, but he didn't. And I absolutely adore how this section ends. For once in his life, Kiryu doesn't beg someone with his fists and forces them to see things his way, but instead uses words and begs Ebina, who despises the Yakuza, to stop seeking revenge against them and to move on with his life, live it, and give others a chance as well. In conclusion, I know this sounds like sarcasm after everything I just said, but I really do like Kiryu as a character. But I feel like the more I see of him, the less I can take him seriously in some very specific regards. It's gotten to a point where, like I said in some of my streams, I just don't really care what they do with Kiryu anymore because somehow it doesn't feel like he evolved much from his first appearance. The most significant shift was definitely in Yakuza 3, where we saw him turn his life around to look after Haruka and all the kids at the orphanage. This changed him as a person, and it's not hard to see that when you compare his demeanor there to the first 2 games. His interactions not only with the kids, but also characters like Rikiya showed a very gentle side of him, one that you could argue was there in 1 and 2 with Haruka, but definitely not as explored as much. The orphanage is a focal point of the story in 3, so you see that aspect all throughout. To highlight this change even further, compare someone like Shinji to Rikiya and you can probably see what I mean. Making this video, I realized a lot of his arcs get repeated either worse or slightly better, and there's no real moving forward with him. As I mentioned earlier, it feels like he himself is torn between multiple places he belongs and just doesn't know which one he truly wants to choose. It's no wonder they wanted to create a new character with Yakuza like a dragon, but he just had to become a secondary protagonist in Infinite Wealth. Not that I'm heavily against it, I still enjoyed a lot of things about him in this game, but he's a character that's just kinda hanging, stagnant. I don't know what more they can do with him at this point except just give him a conclusion and move on to other protagonists. Will I enjoy another Kiryu-focused game? Probably yes, because the story is only one half of a game, and even then, I'm likely to enjoy a lot of parts of it. And if the gameplay is fun, sure, I'm on board. But I'd rather someone else at this point of time. Thank you all so much for hopping on for the ride with this video. I hope at the very least that this was good background noise for you while you do something else. Or I hope it was just a good watch if you were watching intently. I've been wanting to make a discussion video like this for a while, and I'm glad I got to do that now with a topic that I think is a good one to discuss with others. If this wasn't already obvious, the video's intent isn't to tell people that their view of Kiryu is wrong and mine is the one true fact. It's more so presenting a different view of the effect of Kiryu's actions that were likely unintentional in their half-baked intent. I enjoy talking about things like this, so if you have any questions or points to raise, please feel free to do so in the comments below. Hope you have a wonderful day or night, depending on the time there, or maybe a good sleep if you're planning to sleep. I don't know, look, time zones be time zoning, okay? Anyway, I'll see you next time, whenever that is. Bye-bye now.